Hello, this is Brandykins, and welcome to another episode of the Terrorific Talk podcast. This is episode 5. In this episode, I speak with William Robert Webb III, who talks with me about horror, his favorite horror games and films, along with his book, Simply Weird, and the horror films that he's been involved in, namely PMS Cop and House of Demons. This was a live interview recorded on twitch.tv/Brandykins, and there are a few audio issues in the podcast that I just want you to be aware of. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Hello, everybody out there, and welcome to another exciting, fabulous episode of Terrorific Talk. And we have another awesome episode for you this afternoon, because I am interviewing the lovely gentleman to my right here, William Robert Webb III, Rob to his friends and acquaintances. And hello, I'm really excited to have you on here today. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm really excited to be on here. This is good. It's just good.
I am really excited to have you on here. Side note for people who don't know, we kind of know each other in real life, as you call it, because we met last year at a screening at the Alamo Drafthouse of The Thing. Whenever the Alamo Drafthouse was showing us Halloween movies, he just ended up right next to me, just in the seat right next to me, and we just got to talking.
Yeah, I just, it's kind of sometimes what I do, and I have been called Rob a P on some of the film sets and stuff, and so I think I just was talking about stuff. And then afterwards I met you, your mom, and your sister, and I just kind of, for someone who, until my adult life, was an introvert, I pretty much talk quite a lot. It's, about like knowledge and stuff that I know, because I think that's because I've had to deal with learning disabilities my life, entire life. So sometimes I don't know.
Yes.
But yeah, it's been great having it back and forth with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so great to meet another fellow horror enthusiast, because at times, I don't have a lot of people that in my life that I could just sit down and discuss horror with. So whenever I finally get somebody, I'm just like, I'm so excited. I'm pumped. So once again, thank you for taking time out of your day to sit down and talk some horror with me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm really like psyched into doing this.
Awesome.
I know I know it might not seem that way. It's like
yeah,
weird.
What's up?
Yeah, I'm too laid back on this. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like I'm laying in my bed, I got my microphone. It's like I'm good to go.
Yeah, when I start answering questions and stuff, I'm probably gonna be way more animated. That's probably when I get, All
right, so let's just go ahead and just jump right into it and get started. So I always start off every episode of my podcast with the question, why? And let's get more specific here. Why horror? Why the scary? Why the creepy? Why the weird? What is it about it that makes you love it so much?
Well, the thing about horror that, it took me a while. I, as a kid, was pretty much a scary cat. And it took me like a really long time to actually get into horror, particularly horror films. It's kind of odd though, because of course Ghostbusters and Ghostbusters 2 were like two of my favorite movies, but I didn't consider them horror films per se. I saw them as science fiction comedies in the same way that I saw Honey, I Shrunk the Kids or the Back to the Future trilogy as sci-fi comedy. And even though sort of my little gateway into horror was the weirdness of Tim Burton when I was growing up, and even then there was films he was associated with either as a producer or as a director I was afraid to see until I was a teenager. For instance, I like Nightmare Before Christmas and Edward Scissorhands, like both scared me immensely, just seeing Jack Skellington freaked me out until I was like 13 or 14, which is a weird thing. And now I'm completely opposite. Whereas like I've seen, you know, I like Cannibal Holocaust. You know, I've kind of gone the complete opposite kind of way in that one. And but really, what's drawn me to horror, particularly as a creative individual, is there. It's one of the two genres besides comedy where you basically can do anything and you don't have to explain it. You know, like in comedy, you can have something like Monty Python, where okay, two people are slapping a fish. Well, is that funny? Okay, you can do that. In horror, you can have, you know, I guess if this is a big spoiler or not for like Get Out, but like the whole thing of you know, the was that the soul in place or whatever. There's like really no scientific or fantastical explanation for it. It just, you know, someone gets hypnotized in a way that, you know, doesn't necessarily associate with reality. It's that kind of freedom is just invigorating as a creative person, because, you know, I'm huge into like people like David Lynch, and I still like Tim Burton despite, you know, what's his career has been like post Sleepy Hollow. Well, I wouldn't say post Sleepy Hollow. It's maybe post Big Fish, because Big Fish was also still really good. He's had a couple of good ones after that, but that first like that run from Pee-wee's Big Adventure to Big Fish, with maybe even I even like his Planet of the Apes to a degree, but only in ironic way. But like I think everything else besides that one, from Big Fish to from Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and of course I discovered more and more of his stuff, and then I just got into horror as a teenager, and then I also just had a true crime. I also have a fascination with true crime, so I'm on these two different teetering points when it comes to horror, which is the sort of, you know, fantastical, mysterious, unexplainable thing, like I was talking about, that was, you know, in Get Out, in some of the, because some of the science in there didn't need to be logical. It just was using metaphor. And then, for instance, there's a bunch of, in the original film of, because I haven't seen the remake, which I'm not sure if it's this week or next week it comes out, of Suspiria, and which I'm going to mention because I have the new 4K mastered Blu-ray.
Ooh.
And it is in that, from a 4K master that then is, you know, downgraded to 1080p, because it's not a HDR Blu-ray, but I don't even have a HDR television, so but Suspiria has all this just weird, crazy stuff in it that, and yet a mass audience can go and see that. A mass audience isn't going to go see Eraserhead, which is David Lynch's first film, or any of his more weirder, out there kind of things. And what I like about horror is you can do these just insane sort of things without too much explanation. And it's one of those two genres, like I said. And in humor, you can do that in sort of the Monty Python mold of just something happens, you know, and you take it. And with horror, it's like, as long as it's scary and it scares an audience, they can let so much logic. It can have its own dream logic. If you know, I may be just coming off as way too intellectual here, and you know, but you know, I love genre films, and I love artsy fartsy stuff too, and I love the idea of melding the two, which you know, of the stuff I've actually directed, I've directed 3 shorts that have played at the Moxie. Two of the three are flat out artsy fartsy stuff uh, that don't really have a plot, but aren't meant to be scary. And then the one I did in between, I should probably send you a link to because I think you'd like it, which is my tribute to Evil Dead, which is a good thing to bring up. Well, the Evil Dead trilogy, because I'm a huge Sam Raimi fan, and as someone born in Michigan, Sam and Bruce are a big freaking deal. A huge freaking deal since, of my uncle, not at the same time, but my uncle went to the university that Sam Raimi dropped out of to make Evil Dead. So yeah, so like Evil Dead, and it wasn't until years after I'd been a huge fan of the films. I think it was around the time, I mean, I was so huge, and that was another thing that really got me into horror because it felt, for whatever reason, even though it was gory and crazy and all that, it felt safe in the same way that when I was getting into the Tim Burton films I had been afraid of earlier. It's like there were the films that I loved because like I grew up loving Mars Attacks. If I could see it as another genre than horror, but like even his Batman, Tim Burton's movies have elements of horror to them. I mean, at the very least, influences from German expressionist horror. You got Nosferatu and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in there. And of course, Metropolis is in there too, which is not a horror film, but is in German expressionism. And even Jack Nicholson's Joker almost feels like so much a character of the times, and in that sort of cocky, like he's almost like a Freddy Krueger or Chucky kind of character, where he's he is scary. And I still don't get this generation that doesn't think of Jack Nicholson's Joker as scary. You can be, that's like saying, well, then Freddy Krueger can't be scary. He is scary, but he makes the wise cracks, and he's, over the top, and yet at the same time deadly dangerous. And I really liked Heath Ledger's Joker, and I even liked Jared Leto's Joker, but I won't get into debating that. Although I felt Jared Leto's Joker is almost a little bit closer to what Nicholson was doing in that same way, and that's probably why I like it. Is it reminds me, it feels like an updated version. Like if you crossed Nicholson's Joker with like a Cholo kind of guy, you'd get Jared Leto's Joker. But yeah, so man, I'm getting so far off topic on the question. But like I told you, like once I get started, this is this stuff pours out. But yeah, I was always a fraidy cat, and now I'm really into the two elements of horror I really like are the gore, like, but I also like stuff that isn't. I like the cerebral stuff because, like I said, I am a huge. Oh, now I know why I was mentioning Sam Raimi was because my second short film I did, Masks. Well, Masks was like my big tribute to H.P. Lovecraft, the Evil Dead trilogy, Dario Argento, as much as I could get away with, because I was using OTC cameras, and they basically said you had to make stuff PG, so there's no blood in it. Aww. But I got as much like sort of little shocking little things stylistically from Argento's work. I was messing with color. I don't know if I necessarily achieved it right, but that was also because I didn't have lights. I did all natural lighting, and then I just would mess with the colors using post-production instead. Whereas Argento, when he would do the amazing color palette stuff, like in Suspiria, he started doing it in deep red. It's interesting because he had a much more naturalistic lighting style in his first three films when he was a giallo filmmaker. See, this is why people call me Robopedia. And in those films were much more stylistically inspired by Hitchcock. And then he's
Deep Red, which was one of his last ones. It was his last one before Suspiria, and actually had no supernatural elements in it. It kind of hinted at, but it ended up not having any supernatural elements. And then Suspiria, full blown supernatural thing of a story made up by his then longtime partner, Daria Nicoletti, who is Asia's mother. I won't get into that because that's been because of the crazy. Yeah, yeah, I want to talk about it. But Daria Nicoletti uh, was with Dario for for about over a decade, and she even was in his films after they had broken up. Um, and she helped write Suspiria. And she came up with this story that she later, like, it took decades upon decades of her finally admitting it. And she said, yeah, it's BS. But she used to claim that her grandmother would tell her about this, who was a ballerina, went to this ballerina school, and it was run by witches. And she would say that that was the real thing. She goes, like, no, I'd made it up, but I had told Dario that this was a true story that my grandmother had told me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but even though there's magic and there's witches and stuff in Suspiria, there's all this stuff that, you know, doesn't make sense logically it's dream logic, I guess, going to that term. And that is also very prevalent in the Italian horror filmmakers. Even though, like Lucio Fulci, even though he's very much well known for mostly, I mean, he's known as one of the two godfathers of gore, along with the late. It's really sad. How I found out Herschel Gordon Lewis had passed away, because I'm actually a fan of his, even though his stuff's pretty much schlock. But he at least knew his stuff was schlock, and some of them can be pretty fun. I think 2000 Maniacs, if he had kept making films like 2000 Maniacs where he was intentionally trying to be humorous, I think he would have made more good movies. But I don't think he necessarily cared if he made good movies. I think he cared if he made a profit. But he was, he had come out of retirement and was making movies in his 80s, and he had just passed away earlier this year. I sadly found out when I saw a interview that Joe Bob Briggs did with James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd, and that was how I learned about that. But yeah, I'm jumping all over the place. So let me get back to Masks. So that was my second short film, and so I've only directed shorts, but of course I've worked on many features in other areas and stuff. And I just sort of wrap up the whole question, why horror? Well, like I said, it's on one side it's the fantastical, and on the other side you can just do these weird screwed up taboos can be shattered, and I like transgression. Outside of horror, I'm a fan of people like William S. Burroughs, for instance, which, makes so much sense that it'd be a guy like David Cronenberg who'd want to turn Naked Lunch into a movie.
Yeah.
And that his, so my influences come from within and without. I'm a Trauma fan, and yet at the same time I can sit down and watch Stan Brackage's stuff. I did a tribute film of Stan Brackage's films, and they mostly pretty are just short films that have most of the time no plot and have no audio, and sometimes they're just paintings on film. And for some reason I actually got introduced to his stuff through Lloyd Kaufman, the president of Trauma, not personally, but in a commentary track. He mentioned Stan Brakhage because Brakhage actually was an influence on him, and he actually got to interview him while at university. Lloyd had a radio show where he got to interview people, sort of like this. And he got to ask him, and this back in the 60s. And besides that, Stan Brakhage was the teacher of Matt and Trey, the South Park guys, and they did
Oh.
and they gave him a cameo in the very first thing they ever did on a budget, which, you know, because they did because Trey did two short animated films at college. One which was the proto South Park thing that, and then another one was like a history thing where he had his Japanese roommate. That one's harder to find. The proto South Park one where Frosty eats everybody, that one people can find. The second one is like his Japanese roommate who doesn't know anything about American history, is just saying stuff, and then it's in that same cardboard style. It's just animated, and it's like he just gets everything wrong about American history. And I've only seen clips of it. I haven't found the whole thing. But the first real big thing they did was they shot on 16 millimeter, a feature-length film based on a fake trailer they did for a film class, and that was called originally Alfred Packer the Musical, which when it got picked up by Troma became musical. And Stan Brakhage has a line in Campbell the Musical, and through all of that I got into this very artsy guy's work who is considered one of the front grandfathers or godfathers of avant-garde cinema, is basically Stan Brakhage and Kenneth Anger. And I like Kenneth Anger's stuff too. And it's like I can watch some of, not all, but I can watch some of Andy Warhol's films, which are very, very abstract and out there. I can like that stuff, and then I can like Troma, and then I can like some of the trashiest, you know, sort of grindhousey kind of stuff. And then I can just, you know, more mainstream horror, more mainstream comedy. Me actually getting into film, if I'm going to be specific on that, was because of Kevin Smith. I saw Dogma, and that film changed my life. But why horror? Again, I'm going to like cut it off at here so you can ask another question, because I went into so many different avenues, and a lot of that's primarily ADHD. But it's breaking taboos and being graphic. That's something that kind of came later, but just the idea that visually something can just be, you know, or you can have an event in a story, whether it's written or, you know, because I've worked in so many different mediums, that, you know, in a fantasy story, you have to, even if there's magic, you have to totally explain it. In a science fiction story, you have to at least come up with a reason for the science. In horror, you really don't. You can do that, but not all the time, and I love that. And you can do some of these weird artsy kind of things, and as long as it's scary, an audience, you know, as long as you don't like as long as like, critics don't fawn over it too much, because I know that there's sometimes ends up being backlash that people just look at, oh, this is considered, because critics see it as an art house kind of thing. That can sometimes backfire. And while I haven't seen the movie, I know I've seen that happen to, say, Heredity, where people basically said, you know, this isn't a real horror film. This is just an art house film put up. Whereas the guy who directed it was like, no, I literally wanted to make a horror film, although I lied to the company and said, no, this is an art house film, you know? Yeah. So that's a weird other tangent, but let's get to another question, because I know probably you got more questions than.
So yeah, you talked about some of your inspirations, like for your work. You say like H.P. Lovecraft, David Lynch, and who would you say is your biggest inspiration to you creatively?
Well, that's really hard to like say. Like, at least from a filmmaking standpoint, I always have this 4 living filmmakers and 3 dead filmmakers that influenced me the most. The living, it's Guillermo del Toro, Del Toro actually, it took me seeing The Shape of Water where I was like, okay, I'm putting him on the list, because originally it was 3 living and 3 dead, and so now it's Guillermo del Toro. So that's why I mentioned him first, is because he's the new addition, and then David Lynch, obviously, Tim Burton, obviously, and then someone who I have not mentioned, and I have something signed by him, and that is Terry Gilliam, former Python. And I have my copy of Tideland that I have the region 2 of, because they've screwed up the aspect ratio when they released the DVD in the United States. I mentioned that in my letter, and if it says, it says to for Rob, Terry Gilliam, I'm reading your book slowly, because I sent him a copy of this, which, if I'm going to talk about influences outside of film, is heavily influenced by Kurt Vonnegut, the writings of Steve Aylett, and The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. So I'm now, but yeah, 4 living filmmakers: Del Toro, Burton, Lynch, and Gilliam. Of those not living, it's Sergio Leone, Sam Peckinpah, and Akira Kurosawa. I think with Kurosawa, just because Ran was such a important film to see when I was a teenager. I'm still examining that film to this day, and I just love its use of color. And Kurosawa's films actually got me interested in Shakespeare, because of his adaptations, and I saw those before I had to really get into Shakespeare in high school, and so those are some of my favorites of his films, because I think only Ron and Throne of Blood are really, but they're both great. And of course, Throne of Blood is of my favorite Shakespeare play, which is the Scottish play. Being a little superstitious there, which also I think has had the most amount of best, the 3 amazing adaptations. You have Orson Welles' 1940s version, which actually has Scottish accents and is shot in this German expressionist black and white look. Then you have Throne of Blood, 1950s, which is Kurosawa taking into ancient Japan. And then, and let me tell you, I think he's a reprehensible human being, but I do like his work. But Roman Polanski's version from the 70s, which is also by far the most violent version and is almost a horror film, which makes sense because he came out of doing horror films originally, and then didn't make a horror, because after The Tenant, he didn't make a horror film until The Ninth Gate with Johnny Depp.
Oh, yes, I've seen that one.
Yeah, it's pretty good. But yeah, like I said, I don't want to dwell too much on him because he's a completely reprehensible human being. So yeah.
But yeah, it's just like you could think someone is ew, but then still appreciate their work.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like what they found out recently about. Although I'm not a fan of Man-O-War, like I know what the fans of Man-O-War are going through because of what happened with the arrest of their guitarist, and that's just yeah.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, I'll just but yeah, I have a bunch of other influences that I have way too many. To try and steer back onto the question away from some really dark subject stuff. Even music has influenced me. Like I Kerry King of Slayer as an influence, at least influencing like my literature. There's like a whole blurb on my website that cites a bunch of my influences, and even comic book writers influence me a lot. Like I put in Frank Miller, Gail Simone, Neil Gaiman. Although I guess Neil, you can probably say he's everything because he's written movies, he's written books, he's written comics. He's not just a comics guy. So Barry Gifford I like a lot. He doesn't do horror. He does crime fiction, and he's actually from Missouri, and he's a really cool cat who writes some very interesting stuff. He writes the Sailor and Lula novels, which the first of which is Wild at Heart, was adapted by David Lynch, and that's how I became a fan of his. I love that book and I love that movie. I think one of Lynch's more underrated films. And if you like more of the sort of violent blood and gut side of things, albeit in a more crime-driven kind of movie, check out Wild at Heart. It's pretty good, and even though it has some of Lynch's weirdness in it, it's a little bit more straight story than something like Eraserhead or Lost Highway or Mulholland Drive or even some of the stuff in Twin Peaks gets really weird.
That it does.
Yeah. So I just like the weird stuff a lot of times, and then I think I've already cited William S. Burroughs, he did some bad stuff too. I mean, he accidentally killed his wife, and then became famous. The whole weird thing where she put a glass on her head and stuff and said, "Yeah, let's do the William Tell trick," and you're like, and they were just completely blasted out of their minds. And then it was after that, his sort of like weird, because it happened in Mexico, and he had enough money to just get out of going to prison, and but he was in a real big funk, and he identified himself as gay at that time. He would probably be called bisexual today. And after her death, he only was with young men. But he was in this really funk, and that's what led to writing Naked Lunch. So it's a weird thing because he had written 2 novels before, but had that event not happened, it's a really weird situation. And I don't know why I'm talking about William S. Burroughs on a horror podcast.
I mean, hey, it's just like things like that. Horror, it could take like the strangest tangent into like other genres and other authors and places that you wouldn't even think of. It's a multi-nuanced genre that you can't really, as you mentioned kind of earlier, you can't just pin it down to one point or one aspect of anything.
Which is what I like about it.
I love it too. Like you got your, like you say, you got your gore, you got your blood and guts, but then you also got the psychological aspect of it that makes you think and it terrifies you in that way. And then you got the overuse of jump scares, which I will not talk about because I hate it when horror movies do that. But kind of speaking of and transitioning into horror films, you have been involved in several horror films yourself, whether you've been acting in them, whether it's been behind the scenes. So talk a little bit about your experiences in those films and what you did in them.
Well, I worked on how I transitioned into that. Because I was really wanting to work on a feature. I'd done work as a producer by just like giving people checks to, basically patronizing people. Wait, am I using that right now? Well, being a patron to various different people so that and to get their documentaries finished on subjects I really cared about. And I really wanted to work on something physical. And I also was, I think, getting close to one of the last semesters at where I was at OTC. I was at OTC, for those who don't know, that's Ozarks Technical Community College. It's a 2-year trade technical school where I got an Associate of Arts degree in electronic media production, which is a fancy way of basically saying TV, radio, and digital filmmakings. And I was there for 6.5 years, originally going there to just get a transfer degree, go to Missouri State University, and then try and get a creative writing, get both a creative writing degree and a degree, getting 2 bachelors, one in creative writing and one in film. And instead, I just was like, there's no way. So I went and got the EMP one because it just ended up getting the transfer degree. That wouldn't have been anything. So I was still in school and I wanted to work on something. And so I was just looking on Craigslist and I found this thing called PMS Cop. And I was like, okay, this sounds kind of like a trauma thing, trauma style thing. And I look up on the website and I'm seeing like on-set photos of what they had shot so far. And I was like, I gotta work on this thing. I need to work on this thing. I'll do whatever. Like I emailed and the director, Brian Blakey, and I said, I gotta work on this. I gotta do something, whatever. And he's like, yeah, sure. And he accepted my Facebook, friend request. And that was how I got really in touch with him and stuff. And about close to a month went by and some of the production kind of slowed down too. And he was looking for someone, but when I had started contacting him was the stupidest time to do it because the schedule for the film was up on the website, and there's a shower scene that was filmed, and it's in the beginning of the film, and that's what was scheduled when I started contacting him. So he didn't think I was serious. He thought I was just some guy who, was like, that wasn't it, obviously. And I just kind of kept being in sort of social ways, kind of trying to keep in contact with him, and being, us having a mutual interest in the Ramones and this and that. And I think it was like what really broke through was like me just being like, yeah, I love Blue Velvet. Bringing David Lynch again in here, which is interesting. Brian's really likes David Lynch's stuff, but he also likes really gritty crime stuff. Like I know Michael Mann has a huge influence on him. He loves Manhunter and Thief and Heat, like, and in portions of PMS Cop, you can actually see the actual cop stuff in there. You can see the influence of that. And anyway, so he eventually was like, okay, we're going to do a test. I go, okay. What was this test? What is this test? Is basically, because he eventually saw my YouTube page that had all my projects from my EMP classes. He's like, okay, this guy is legit. This guy is not a creep. And I like his framing, his shots. So he said, what we're going to do is we are going to film out. We're going to take the seat out of the back of a car. We're going to set up the tripod, because it's a special tripod that you can just put into these really weird angles and stuff. And we're going to put the camera there, and you're going to be shooting out of the window. And what we're going to try and do is, because if we have it dark enough to where you can't tell whose house it is, but you can see enough of it, he was like thinking of using it for like the opening credits. And so we would do these passes. And so you'd have me with this, just standing up in the back of this car with a camera, and just say, okay, you know, and him driving with his assistant director in the passenger seat, and it connected to a computer so that they could see what was coming through the camera and stuff. And it was just to kind of see if I could, you know, be competent enough. And then as we were about to, we did a couple of trial runs. As we were about to do the real thing, he noticed a car was following us, and he then slowed down, and this old man came up to us, and he said, "Well, what are you doing? What are you doing around here?" You see, and the guy identified himself as a retired policeman, and really scruffy old dude, one of those guys who obviously still wished he had some sort of authority. And Brian was explaining that we were getting pickup shots for filming, and he's like, I've been, you know, and Brian's like, I've been working and doing films in some form or another for about 20 odd years. And he goes, well, I've never heard of something like that, a pickup, or, you know, like just guy not understanding film lingo. He goes, I think you're casing the houses so that you can, you know, steal from them. He goes, and then Brian goes, he goes, sir, I don't think there's anything you have that I'd want to steal. And then he just drove off, and we then basically hid in a Walmart parking lot for an hour, and then we shot stuff and sat, and then we did go and shoot the thing. And then because of the lens that he was using, we ended up not using it anyway, but he basically was like, okay, you can do some of the camera operating stuff. And so I'm credited as a camera operator, but I also did a bunch of other kind of crazy stuff, you know, just whenever there needed to be hands, you know. But I was one of the camera guys. Even if I didn't wasn't the one who was using it, I was always the one who was assembling them. And I got really good at that, and I really liked that because eventually I got my own DS, because we shot a T2i, which is a Canon DSLR. I eventually got a 7D, and it's not that different to assemble, because you have to assemble, disassemble, because you have multiple lenses on these, and the thing inside it, if you don't want dust and stuff, so you have to do these thorough cleanings before you put it together, and then when you take it apart and put it in its place. And so that was one of my main jobs besides being a camera operator. And on an uncredited thing, I think I got to squirt blood on one of the actresses. And then at one point he was like, okay, you've obviously read the script. I was like, I had perused the script. I said, yeah, you know, I know the general outline and stuff. Well, you know who Slick is? And I said, yeah, I know Slick's the cocky computer tech IT guy. He's the IT guy. What? Why? And he goes, well, you've acted in some of your stuff for school, right? And I said, yeah. He's like, well, I think you're good in those, and I think you have the right look to play Slick. And I was like, okay, sure. You know, I had done drama in high school and stuff, and I had to learn lines and stuff. I always hated learning lines, but that was like my big fear about it. But like my mom was like, go do it, like just do it. And even then it wasn't a complete, you know, thing of this is going to be happening. He just was going to audition me, and he auditioned a couple other people besides me, and then he got me on. He was like, no, you're Slick, and we shot about most of my stuff because I'm in a control room. We did most of my stuff in 2 days. There was like a weekend where we couldn't get anybody, and so it was just me talking to nobody. And then there was a third day when when some people actually had to be in my control room and I had to interact with them. And maybe those were 2 other days. Maybe it wasn't just one. But yeah, that was interesting. And I it's been cited in a couple of the reviews as, you know, because most people really talk up the 2 actresses who played the titular character of the PMS cop, play the actress who plays her as Mary, and then before she transforms into the PMS cop, who was played by Cindy Means, and they both get, you know, and if they mention anybody besides the 2 of them, for some reason they mention me because I was the comic relief, and I gotta get killed in it. And there's a very funny story about that, which is he had to kind of tweak it a bit because I was supposed to go back and forth, and he was supposed to get blood on me, and I was supposed to go no, you know, like Willem Dafoe in the end of Platoon, where it's like,
yes,
you know,
yeah.
and I was supposed to do that, but I was like going like that, so he had to slow it down, and it wasn't until after we were done and I was just drenched with fake blood that he's like, okay, we'll fix it. We'll find. I'll just slow it down so nobody knows you just look too goofy doing that. So, yeah. And then I also got one of my friends who also was a big instigator in introducing me into sort of more obscure horror films. My friend Joshua Scott, and he got to play one of the lab techs who got killed. He actually got to play a very lecherous guy, and he's the complete opposite of that. He's actually a really nice dude, and he also had gained a lot of weight at that point, and I was really pushing for him to be in the film because when we made PMS Cop earlier that year, he had a health scare, and I was like, well, I at least want him to do something. So he's in there. And he's gotten way healthier since then. Well, at least last time I've seen him. There's a video on my YouTube channel of him, you know, when the film came out, because it took a couple of years, when it got released by Full Moon, and who's the producers of the Puppet Master series. They eventually saw the film and bought the distribution rights from Brian. And that's, although it's one of those things where it was an extremely low budget film, and yet a lot of people think it's a legit Full Moon production, which I'm pretty proud of. That's a fact. When it was just a little, I'm not going to say the budget, but a very micro budgeted horror film made here in Springfield, Missouri, you know. So there was that. So that was one of the horror films I've been involved in. PMS Cop. And that was, you know, one of those, you know, you volunteer because you believe in the project, and because it's a micro budget, and the more credits you get, the more you can. People will go, okay, so if they've worked on this, and this, you know, because I've had to explain this to people, and I've also had to do this in comics. There's a comic I wrote, hasn't come out yet. As a writer, you gotta take up free gigs if you're gonna be a comic book writer.
Yep.
Just is. That's just the way it is. It's Whereas other people are like, well, I'm just going to wait for only the gigs that pay. It's like, well, dude, that's not how it works. If you, in a lot of these creative industries, you know, you end up having to do a lot of stuff. And I'm working with Brian again. He's doing another horror film called Acid Master. Right now we're sort of doing the grindhouse approach of doing the trailer before we actually do the movie. So we're doing that, and we're filming that. We've been filming that in the last month or so. And I'm really excited about that. And So I think it's kind of known that he's doing it because he put a video out for auditions. So I don't think that's like revealing any big thing. He's gonna be doing that. Um, so that was PMS Cop. There's another funny anecdote, but that had to do with the real cops. But I'm saving that because that's one I usually use at conventions. I usually give this one, and it's funny because it's like the first day I work on there, there's something crazy. Also, I forgot to mention that Brian said he could tell that the old man definitely had some kind of handgun concealed. So yeah,
Ooh.
yeah, I know. And it was that was why he did that whole line about, um yeah, I don't think you have anything I want, and then just drive like crazy out of there. And
Yeah.
it was one of the few times we didn't since it was such a simple thing, but every single time we were going to film something, even if it was in a location that we had the rights to do it and all that, Brian made sure to call the cops, and that was one of the few times. But I don't think that guy would have cared, Um, so that was PMS Cop, and all I'll say about Acid Master is I'll work with Brian anytime, anywhere, for free, because he's just a really good guy to work with, and I think he's becoming a better and better filmmaker with each film. And it wasn't necessarily a horror film, but there was a kind of a revenge, an artsy revenge short film he did, called Transient Error, in which I played a hobo, and that's actually I think my best acting ever. I actually think is in that. I it's actually, unlike PMS Cop, it's very serious. It's very slowly paced. It was very heavily influenced by the Nicholas Winding Refn film, uh, Only God Forgives. So it has that kind of pacing where there isn't that much dialogue, and it's very serious, and it is about 20 minutes, and it's on YouTube. So that's PMS Cop. Now, the other horror film that I'm heavily involved with, and I have sort of a financial stake in people going out and buying copies of House of Demons, originally titled Trip House. Go out and buy House of Demons. Help me, get some cash off of that, as because I'm an executive producer on that. I became an executive producer as a result of becoming friends with Patrick Meany, because I gave him money to finish. Well, not even finish. I think was this before he started, or if it was the actual budget or something. But I was a co-producer on a documentary he did called The Image Revolution, which was a really cool documentary he did about the history of Image Comics, from how it went from, all the guys from Marvel leaving and forming their own company, straight up to, Robert Kirkman coming up with The Walking Dead, and how that, yeah, it covers that whole thing, and it does it in a really brisk, I guess, 90 minutes. And I was one of the first people to see it, because I was like, I was like, here's some money, that was how that was how I was at the time. Was that any project that was a documentary that I was like, oh, I would have wanted to do that, I get in touch with people. I did the same thing with the late John Schnepp, who made Whatever Happened. No, I always get the title mixed up. The Death of Superman Lives, What Happened. And I'm an associate producer on that because he needed some funds in post-production, because he pretty much spent all of his Kickstarter money for the actual production, and he needed money to finish post-production. And so I gave him some money and got an associate producer's credit and got to keep in touch with him a little bit. I think I annoyed him a lot because he ended up ghosting me because I know he said that there were going to be 3 screenings for that documentary, and one of them was supposed to be in Chicago, and I was like, that's one I can make, man. When Chicago, like, I would do that, and then he just like stopped getting in touch with me, and he unfollowed me on Twitter, and I just was like, yeah, I really just pushed him too hard, and there never were other 2, and I didn't even know until like it was like a month before he passed, because he passed this year, and he's a very young guy. He got into a coma for some reason, and then he never got out of it. And even though I'd only had a couple like emails with him, and I helped him on this film, because I kind of was like, great, that was another like documentary idea that I wanted to do. I was like, the Tim Burton Superman film that never got made. Well, this guy's doing it. Well, okay. Something was with the image revolution, and so I was like, yeah. And as part of the deal, I got a co-producer credit. I got to speak with Patrick on the phone and be in contact with him, and I got to see the cut of the film that they felt was the final cut and wanted my opinion. I had a lot of, let them know, because I think either PMS Cop had finished or I was in the midst of it when I got to talk to him, to Patrick, and we had a long conversation about film. We had a long conversation about comics and film, and he just thought I was a neat guy, and I had given him a certain amount of money. So we just kind of like loosely keep in touch for a couple of years. And he's directed a bunch of documentaries, and he decides he wants to do his first non-documentary feature, and that's going to be a horror film. And he just emails me, and he basically goes, here's the deal. I need X amount of money by X amount of time. You'd be not only would you get a producer credit, but you'd be able to eventually get royalties. And I'm not going to be specific on those terms because, for obvious reasons. And if you want, you can actually be on set and observe and that kind of stuff. And on top of this, he said, the log line he gave me was, the tone of the movie is Donnie Darko meets The Shining. And it's called Trip House. Are you in? Are you out? So I'm freaking out. And I talk to my mom. And I say, well, this is how much it's going to be. And this is the most amount of and what it is the most amount of money I'd ever put into any film. And at that, when I was doing that, I still had a janitorial job. And so my mom was kind of like, yeah, if you're just throwing away your money. At that point, my father had passed away, and I had inherited money from his trust. And that's mainly what I live off now. And I'm actually pushing harder and harder to actually work on projects where I still love to do free stuff. I don't hate doing it. Like I said, I'll work with Brian, for free for the rest of my life, even if he gets a real budget. The thing is, though, I've got to manage my money a little bit better now. But at that time, I sold some stock, because that's mainly what my stuff's is in stock. And I gave it to Patrick. And another big deal was, these are SAG actors. Amber Benson from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, who played Willow's girlfriend. She's in the film. I didn't get to meet her because I wasn't there for any of the days that she was there. But I was there for Chloe Dykstra, who is John Dykstra's daughter, which I didn't know until months later, I didn't know she was in this really funny short called Wrestling Isn't Wrestling that Max Landis did. I highly recommend it. It's really good. I know she's gotten some shade from the internet because of the whole what she said about her relationship with Chris Hardwick and stuff like that. But she seemed like a really nice person to me. So I don't know. So I don't know on that. But she was really cool. So anyway, give the money, works out because if he didn't get the money, I think I was one of the last investors. If he hadn't gotten it by a certain amount of time, production wouldn't have started. So I get in touch with him, and this is around the same time I'm talking with John Schnepp. That was the other reason why, because it would have been, okay, do I do the LA premiere of Superman, The Death of Superman Lives in LA, or do I wait it out and I drive to Chicago, Illinois from Springfield? And that was my thinking at the time, not thinking, well, Schnepp might end up having to cancel the other two because he got, again, in over his head. Like, I know he was still shipping Kickstarter rewards about a month or two before he passed this year.
Wow.
So the LA premiere was the only one. And I still feel like really like a heel, just, bugging him about the Chicago premiere, especially now with him having been gone. But anyway, back on House of Demons, I just was like, okay, what's a good day? What's a good day? What's a good day? I got it because I want to get the plane tickets so far ahead of time that they're really cheap. And so he goes, okay, so I have 3 days set. And he goes, if everything goes right, they'll be filming for those 3 days. So it comes. And I end up, oh, that's right. I did a convention the week before. I did a convention. Oh yeah, I forgot that. That's right. I did River City Comics Expo, which is in Arkansas, and I had done that because I, off the back of Simply Weird, my book that is about a fake comic book company, history of a fake comic book company. Because of that, I've done a lot of comic book conventions. So I went straight. I had I think 3 days where I just kind of, was tired and just trying to rest up. And then I did a red eye at midnight going from Springfield to, I believe, Houston, and getting very confusing directions from the stewardess on how to get from my plane to the plane to LA. Now, there were these two IRS agents who specifically deal in livestock. It's like making sure that when people say on their taxes, what livestock, the amount they have and stuff, that, it's real and stuff. And I'd actually started talking up because they had a DSLR. Hey, I've got a 7D. What do you got? I always do that because I'm always fascinated by what your camera, it's like I'm a filmmaker, so that, and especially since DSLRs are being used so much more on micro budgeted films, so they were nice enough. They were like, oh yeah, of the two, there's a gal and a guy, and the gal was like, yeah, we've taken this route dozens of times. The gate you're looking for that's on your ticket, you could do X, Y, and Z. And I basically got there, I think, 2 minutes before they were boarding. So I got there, and then I'm in the middle seat, and to the left of me is a mother with her newborn, And to the right of me is a teenager who I knew was not, who's just totally zoning out by listening to your stuff, on her iPhone, hip hop stuff, and which was probably a really good idea because for about the first half an hour, that baby just was crying, 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 crying. And so I go, okay, trying to listen to classical music because there still was like a phone jack and stuff in there, but I was like trying to drown out. And then Stewardess goes, when they're serving out drinks, is like, would you like anything, any liquor? I was like, do you have any whiskey? They're like, yes. Well, we'll look. And so I have whiskey with Diet Coke because I don't like regular Coke. So that's what I did. Even though, because like, keep in mind, this is by this point it's early in the morning because it was it's like 3 or 4 a.m. because I'd gotten in on there's a red eye from Springfield to Houston, then Houston to LA. That was weird. Some spit just kind of went down. So I get off from the plane, and everybody in the production's still sleeping. They're, I call Patrick and I call Jordan's his producing partner, who's been his producer on all of his documentaries and his producer on this, and who also does the cinematography. And he's a really nice guy and a really good cinematographer. And he was like, he's like, okay, because Patrick got me in touch with him. He's like, okay, because he was in the apartment he was renting had him and a bunch of the other crew members, and he was like, okay, just like get a taxi to this location, and I'll buzz you in, because it's one of those where it's completely locked and needs to be buzzed in. So I'm like, okay, this is my first time in LA. I'm like, already things are just crazy. I'm like, okay, I'll get to meet them. And we're shooting in Santa Clarita, which wasn't the TV show hadn't been done yet, so most people probably weren't familiar with the city. Because the Netflix show hadn't been made yet. So I think by the time our film came out, it had. But I was always like, I was really in Santa Clarita. It's this place that's right outside LA, and it's very small, and it's So what we're doing is I'm taking a taxi to their apartment. I get breakfast, and then we're like, okay, we're gonna go film, and I'm just completely drained. I'm just like, okay, cool. And I say, hey, is it okay if I go to my motel, because I have my motel's out near to where the location's at, so that would be easier for them to drive me, because I do not have a license. Never have. I failed the written for a permit 3 times, so I don't drive. I'm 32 and I do not drive. So they drop me off at the motel, and they say, well, there's a problem. And I said, I've got my information here. This is, they're like, okay, we'll charge you. It's like, wait, what? We'll charge you when you get out and stuff. And I had the money. I was smart enough. I'd put a certain amount of money just in case. But it was it Priceline? What's the one that Shatner? Priceline. So it was Priceline, and because I had done it with Priceline, they were like, oh, it's a thing where because you did it so far back, that's why. So I said, oh, freaking crazy. And I was like, okay, can I at least put, okay. And it's like one of those things where it's like, well, we'll call and try and set things up. And it's like, so we didn't have time to do that. So I kept my luggage in the car the guy was getting us to the location. Then we go to the location. Location's great. And yeah, because I was like, yeah, I'm not going to keep the guys up. But they gave me the key, and then the key wouldn't work. And I was so, because I had been up for over 24 hours. I was like freaking crying because I was like, why is this not working? And it was like, no, it's the wrong room, dude. And the joke on set was I was Shatnered because it was Priceline. But yeah, that was like the most. After that, it was pretty clear sailing, with the one exception of when I got back to my room after shooting the first of the 2 days, and then there was a third day that I had planned in just in case, and they're like, yeah, there's nothing planned there, which was kind of a good thing because I think I was too exhausted from the previous 2 days, and I helped break down the set, and it was, I think, really magical and interesting that I was there for the last 2 filming days of the main location of the actual titular House of Demons, which was then still called the Trip House because it was called Trip House. And then that got picked up by Smith Global Media. I believe that's they're called. Let me double check, but I think it is Smith Global Media. Yes, who has some type of distribution deal with Sony that I don't know, like, because there is no Sony packaging on it or anything. And but yeah, that's more of the art on the weird artsy fartsy kind of, but also on that whole thing we were talking about earlier about, not having to have stuff make sense because it deals with time travel, but there's, not real science to it, and it's a very interesting film. And so those are like, those are the 2 that I've worked on, and then of course also I directed the short film Masks, and I'm helping Brian Blakey out with Acid Master any way I can. So that's the film stuff.
All right, now talk a little bit more just about your comic that you wrote, Simply Weird. You said it wasn't like necessarily horror, but you have mentioned it a few times like throughout the podcast. So tell us more about it.
Simply Weird is a it's like written like a nonfiction book. It's not actually a comic, although I have written comics as a result. I actually kind of got my foot in the door. It's a self-published, but it's like written like like I came up with like this fake comic book company and had it as if there was this other company alongside Marvel, DC, and then occasionally, EC Comics in the 50s, and then there's always sometimes a third one. So it's written in a humorous way. A big influence beside, my writing style particularly, I like Kurt when it comes to my humor in this thing is a lot of it's very Kurt Vonnegut-ish, or at least I feel it is. Others might disagree. There's also, like Kurt Vonnegut, I use my crappy drawings as for humorous purposes, just like he would do in stuff like Breakfast of Champions. But it like basically talks about like all these different comics. It was basically me kind of getting every single comic idea that I had at the time that I wanted to get out, and I wrote it as sort of a quarter life crisis sort of thing because I was like, it was also part of the push that led me to just seek out a production that just eventually ended up being PMS Cop. So it is in that same kind of area and space, and I can't believe that, the book's like, I think I think I wrote it 7 years ago, and then it published 6 years ago. So that's crazy. And then,
Wow.
yeah, I know it's crazy, and I've used it and to be at conventions. Like I got to be on one of the lowest guys on the totem pole of guests at Vision Con the year that Ernie Hudson was like the head uh, guest, and that was fun because that was like you know, Ghostbusters just so ingrained into me. It's in my DNA, just is. But yeah, I've done all these other, and then I've also done River City Comics Expo a couple of times, and I did this one uh, upstart thing called Lebanon Comic Con or Lebanon Con or whatever it was called.
One
That
of
was
those
main,
names.
yeah. Well, it was kind of cool because some of the guys they had was kind of cool because they had Rob Zombie's former bassist. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. I actually bought from him a copy of uh, one of the early solo zombie albums that he recorded on, and I had it signed out to Rob, not thinking, like, because I said, yeah, I go by William Robert Webb III, but you can just sign it to Rob. Not, and it wasn't until I actually got home I was like, to Rob from him, and then in big letters it said, Rob Zombie. I'm trying to remember which one it was. Was it Sinister Urge or Hill? I think maybe it was Hellbilly. What was it? Hellbilly something something. It was one of those. And I do like I like Rob Zombie's movies, and I'm of his music. I like some of his solo stuff, but I really love White Zombie. I actually have the box set, and that's right next to me. Um,
Cool.
yeah, which has like some of the early stuff that's like you can't get on CD unless you like their early stuff before they were at Geffen. Like all the music that they recorded when they got signed at Geffen is available on CD. But if you want some of the stuff that was from like the indie labels that they did in the mid to late 80s, all that stuff is only in the box set. So, and as you know, but I like Rob Zombie's movies, and I don't know why I'm bringing him up on that because the movies are what led to the other guys in his first solo band to leave was because they were like, we want to make stuff. So, but also I got to meet the guy who played Grandpa in Texas Chainsaw Massacre because
Oh,
he was at that. Yeah,
how
I
cool.
wish I had really talked to him more because I just he was sitting next to one of my very close friends, who's a comic book artist named David Fought, not Faust. That really bugs him, and people accidentally do that. But David is a really really nice guy, and he does sort of like two types. He's done comics, but he also does pinup art, and he does uh, beautiful women and monsters. So he does a lot of monster stuff too. And he got to sit. His booth was right next to the guy who was the grandpa. And of course, he was like, and that guy was like 21 when he played the grandpa, because that was a whole prosthetic thing. And I was like, talk. I just thought, hey, that'd be kind of cool. Talk to him, and I gave him a copy of Simply Weird, just because I did. And I did the same thing for. I think the guy's name's Rick. Man, I'm trying to remember the name of the bassist for Rob Zombie, but especially since he was a cool guy and I got to take photos with him. But the guy who played Grandpa in the original Texas Chainsaw, I really like. It was like later I was like, there's all these like little facts I know that I would have loved to have talked to him about. Like I know the legend goes he had to sleep in the makeup because they were afraid that if they took it off, they couldn't put it back on. So because they shot his scenes over a 2-day period, so he slept with that makeup on, because the guy who did the prosthetics in the movie wasn't a special effects guy. I think he was a dentist or something, or he was some kind of doctor or something, and that was how he created the stuff using some kind of plasters type stuff. I have to go back to commentary tracks, and that also reminds me, there again is another person we lost, Toby Hooper, last year. I mean, that just, yeah.
It's just like we're losing all the good horror people. Just like I know whenever George Romero passed, so it's just like
I mean, and that was like, I'm trying to remember if it was right before, it was like right before or right after. I know it was like right within the same time frame as Toby, which was like, which also reminds me of like when I found out how Wes Craven had passed. I was I was at, I think it was the second time I was at River City Comics Expo, and I was sharing a room with my mom and a friend of mine who's another artist friend who I was sharing a booth with, and we were all rooming in the same thing, and I was sleeping on the floor while they had beds. And so I wake up and it's like, oh yeah, Wes Craven died. And I was like, that's the first thing I hear. I was like, dude, that's not a cool joke. That's not a good joke. And it's like, no, dude, he died while you were asleep. He died. I was like, it was just a really weird way for it to happen, is that, it wasn't like, didn't even have time to like, how it is on like trending topics on search engines and stuff. It was just no, he's dead. Jeez.
Yeah, good morning. Oh, by the way, he passed away. Like, thanks. That's a great way to wake up.
I know, right? That was crazy.
Jeez Louise.
Yeah.
All right, let's kind of start winding down here and then talk about horror games. Now, of course, I create content on Twitch, so I love playing any kind of scary horror weird games. So, what are some of your favorites?
This Corpse Party.
Corpse Party.
I have this. Yeah, I have the. Do they call it special? Oh, Back to School Edition. That's what they call it. They call it the Back to School Edition. And even though I have the original Corpse Party downloaded onto my I was like, I gotta get it again, because I didn't have a physical copy, and I need to finish 3. I just started playing through, and there's extra content. It's like each time they add different subplots that you can unlock. It's kind of it's an RPG-ish light novel, and it's very gory, but at the same time, when you're walking around in the UI, it looks like, how like 16-bit RPGs, are how it would be top down and stuff. It's kind of like that. It has that look, and then when something important happens, it then has cinematic mode. Then everybody looks like they're from. It's interesting because the designs for the characters look like they would fit more in some teen high school comedy anime, and then you get to see some of them just eviscerated and just like torn apart and stuff. And it's a really interesting series that has, with each new one has an interesting additional mythology. And I've only the first one's available on PC, and basically if you to get the full series that they've at least released here in the States, you've got to have a PlayStation Vita.
That's very obscure.
Well, like, I got a Vita because I'm into light novels, and so that was basically all I had was that, and then the specific Katamari Damacy that came out for that, and so I have a couple of things like that. Maybe one day they will reveal, because the first two games were released on PC, and then they did an upgraded version of it for the PSP, and then that was successful enough that there was a sequel on the PSP, and I don't think those got translated until they started having PSP downloadable games on the Vita, and then those would come as a 2-pack. So I got to play the first two games together as a 2-pack on my Vita, which I don't really play that much anymore. Like, I just got it because I was like, well, there's a couple of light novels on here, and that was mainly why I got. And I was like, this looks interesting. It's a horror game, and it's a light novel, and it's and I don't want to like spoil too much about the first game because it has some really interesting twists in the story too, besides being, having some pretty gory stuff in it. It has a really interesting atmosphere because you're basically going through this it's a Japanese elementary school that's like in a hellish dimension, and all sorts of crazy stuff happens, and it's really cool. And how it works is like it's divided into chapters, and there's like, to get to the next chapter you have to do things correct, but you can get bad endings. So like each chapter has like, you got this bad ending which killed your character and all that, and it's like, and not all the characters survive. So even with the good ending, some of the characters die. So, and in horrible ways. And I'm not going to say which ones survive and which ones don't, and what are some of the twists and turns, but I especially the first one's really good. The second and third, maybe the reason why I sort of gotten away from the third was they started to put a lot of backstory that kind of bogged things down. That was still interesting, but it was like, man, the first one's a lot more simpler in its twist and turns. And I just love the series. And what I was going to show with this, because I think you can just get the 3DS version, but I got the one, and these are two of the characters, and you have to assemble them, and they have two different faces that you can choose from. So I was like, and hands. So you have these two below the two characters are disembodied faces and disembodied hands, and then the stands that they're supposed to be on. So I have not even opened the plastic on this thing because I was like, I don't know how
what am I gonna do with this?
Yeah, I was like, might as well just keep it that way. And when they had the Corpse Party 3 and actually had a physical release, I have that somewhere else in the house, and I got the special edition for that, and that came with a CD, and this one also comes with, because they redid the music because it's the 3DS I think has a better chip system than the original PSP. So this is another, but I have the special edition of Corpse Party 3, which has all the music from the two PSP games and then the one Vita game, and so I'm a huge fan of that series. Also, just like randomly, I'm also really like Castlevania. Castlevania's great.
Oh yeah, never got to play much of those. Symphony of the Night I really, really loved playing back in the PS2 days, which is ironic because it's a PS1 game, but I really loved playing as Alucard. So if we're talking about games like that's, and then
there's a couple of other, like, if I just would have to look through like my Steam account where there are other visual novels. Like that's I'm typically at right now is visual novels when it comes to horror, like, which is not so much. I'm trying to think if I've played anything horror based on my Xbox One. It's like, no, not recently.
Nothing recently has come out that has caught much of your interest.
Nah. Well, it's like stuff that I have been playing. Have non-horror was there was a really good sale for the remastered edition of LA Noire, and I had never played that, and I got for like a download of it for $20. I was like, that's pretty good. Xbox One version of the remastered edition, and it's pretty good game. I'm actually impressed with like the as a filmmaker, the motion capture stuff, like how like you can tell if you're familiar with like the character actors that they hired to play certain characters, you're like, you can tell from the way they look. It's kind of I'm kind of like, whoa, that's crazy. I was like, yeah, I don't know that actress's name, but I know that's that,
Yeah, so. Yeah, that's her.
Yeah.
It's that person that played that part, that thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember playing LA Noire, and I think my main mistake was just playing it straight through. I probably should have just spaced out my playthroughs and my days in between that, because I kind of thought it was okay.
I think I don't know. I just got really into it, but then again, I don't know. I really like that sort of world. The only thing I was kind of disappointing is that it wasn't as like that was much more linear a game than say something like GTA. Since I would have liked it more if instead of like, okay, here's a case that
right.
It was more open sandbox. That's my only problem. Because I was expecting that, seeing as even though I don't think it was the exact same developers, it was a different part of because it was a different part of Rockstar than the ones who make the GTA games. But I had assumed, that. But then again, I don't know the production history of LA Noire. I think it might have even been picked up by Rockstar, and that the original company were only like midway through it or something. I don't know. I heard something like that. But yeah, I've been playing that, and then I also finished a JRPG, which that's another thing I'm really into is JRPGs, and I finished Shining Resonance, which is in the Shining series, which is all back in the Genesis days is like, Shining in the Dark, Shining Force 2, and that's what got me to RPGs. And Shining Resonance is pretty good.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
It's just that, like, yeah, we're getting off horror again, and this is like that's the only reason why I'm like, but yeah, that's I really like JRPGs and stuff that's like really odd too.
Yeah, I don't mind just on some instances getting away from horror, because the conversation goes where it goes. It's just like my idea, like I always tell my guests, like whenever they're on here, it's just like this is just like conversation, almost just like we're sitting down across from each other talking about stuff.
Yeah.
So it just goes where it goes at times.
It does. Yeah.
And that's fine. It's just like I have like the linear stuff that I want to ask, but then if it gets like ventures off, it's at weird tangents, I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Right. So now let's see if anybody has any questions for you. But while we're waiting on those questions, plug yourself. Where can people buy your films that you were involved in? Simply Weird. Where can they find you on social media? So sell yourself.
Okay, so I have a website. It's dot William Robert Webb III.com. So William Robert Webb III should be pretty easy. That has links to every single social media thing I got. You can also email me through there. There's a special contact page. It's got a very personal comic that I wrote that's in there. There's also a page dedicated to Simply Weird, and where you can buy either a physical copy or digital copy of Simply Weird. And it also has a couple of blurbs, like for instance, if you want to know what Patrick Meany, director of House of Demons and The Image Revolution, what he had to say about Simply Weird, well, that's on the page for Simply Weird. And then there's a bunch of pictures of me looking just kind of trying to be demonic or heavy metal or something on the first page. And that has a fuller biography on me, and also includes some of my influences. It ends on that. And but if you want to check me out on Twitter, it's at Tetsuo_man. I'm
Yep, and I've got your Twitter name
Yeah.
right down below the camera.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and then let me see about the cause yeah, I'm trying to find my, because on YouTube I go as Tetsuo the Great, no spaces. So yeah, let me see about, yeah, it just says, yeah. So just go youtube.com/user/TETSUOTHEGREAT. So.
All right. So, and where can people buy House of Demons and PMS Cop?
They are available on DVD on Amazon.
Okay.
You can get them on Amazon. At least for House of Demons, you can even digitally rent House of Demons or digitally buy it. So.
All right, so that's whereabouts on the World Wide Web that people can find your stuff, buy your stuff, and chat with you about all sorts of other stuff if they want to.
Yep.
All right, so I didn't see any questions in here, so I guess we will go ahead and end it here. So, Rob, once again, thank you for taking time out of your afternoon to come and chat with me about horror and all sorts of other like weird tangents that the conversation went off in. I greatly appreciate it, and I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that we will definitely be talking again.
Yep.
Hey, bye.
Bye.